Hello everybody, welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is David in conversation with Dr. Alex Belser, who has been on our show way back in the old days of 2019. So yeah, lots happened since then. How are you doing today, Alex?
It's good to be back. Feeling good today. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, we just had a lovely chat kind of backstage, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about lots of things, but obviously there's probably two main things around kind of queering psychedelics and psychedelic assisted psychotherapy on the more kind of clinical research side of things. So those are my two goals for the chat. I'd love to start just by getting a sense of what's changed since you were last on the show 4 years ago. A lot has changed, and I'm thinking both looking at queerness around what's happening in that kind of cultural context and conversation, and around the psychedelic renaissance. Like, lots of progress has been made on both of those, and I'm just interested to think, what similarities, what kind of synergies are there between the experiences of these two underground cultures kind of coming out and burgeoning through the surface.
It's been an incredible 4 years for so many reasons. I'll start with the latter part, which is that, in 2019, there still hadn't been a gigantic corporate boom of venture capital and 70 plus companies coming out. But if you chart the papers, and it's just been a geometric expansion. I mean, literally, just like it starts to climb the wall with a number of peer-reviewed articles in psychedelics. I mean, when I did my dissertation, I had been publishing in psilocybin research at NYU, and I called it medication-assisted therapy in my CV, for example, like with my committee and other people, because I didn't want the standard academics to know that I was doing psychedelic research, even though I was actually publishing on it. I sort of obscured it ever so slightly. And now, not just after Pauline's book, but, with this sort of massive university effort to, put psychedelic medicine right at the center of potential new ways of treating people, there's been a change in the wind. And you can talk to soccer moms about psychedelics and microdosing, and it suddenly is the Overton window has opened wide enough that that's allowed, which is pretty neat. There's also been a massive crash in that field. A lot of the funding has dried up, a lot of the philanthropic funding has dried up, a lot of the capital has dried up, for better and for worse. And so there's been sort of some of the original expansiveness and sort of like big dreams are sort of like, okay, let's get real here. And so there's a lot of brass tacks controversies and conversations happening about what's important with psychedelic therapy, what's important with medicine, how much is this going to cost, how are we going to actually get CPT codes into the into the payment paradigms of the U.S. healthcare system. So all of that's happened, and even in the last 4 years. So it's been a little bit of a head spinner for me. And for today is June. We're recording on June 1st. It's the first day of Pride Month. I think a lot has happened, and we should probably talk more about it. But a lot has happened with the sort of crossover between psychedelic research and history and culture and consciousness and sexual and gender minority people. I had been going to psychedelic conferences since 2001. I thought I knew not everything, but a lot about the psychedelic history and movement and original resources. And I had gone to thousands of psychedelic talks, and I had never heard anyone once mention that psychedelics had been used not just once or twice, but repeatedly and in the mainstream as conversion therapies against gay men, bisexual, queer, lesbian women, trans folks, gender nonconforming people, through the 1950s, through the 70s, and beyond. And no one ever talked about it. And so I was sort of originally scratching my head, saying, hey, did I miss something, or is there some sort of, did I forget to check my inbox? Like, why is nobody talking about this? We're talking about MK Ultra, we're talking about sexual abuse harms, but we're not talking about this vast history of which more than a half dozen scholars have written about now. And so there's been a movement that has been growing in the field around queer folks broadly speaking, coming together in part to write a book with 42 queer authors called Queering Psychedelics. I was the lead editor of that with Bia Labache and Clancy Kavnar. There's been a couple of big gatherings and conferences for LGBTQIA plus people to talk about psychedelics. And there's also been a movement to kind of compel straight folks and allies in the community to like actually take a look in the mirror about implicit ways that our practices in the clinic are transphobic, homophobic, and convey a type of heteronormative privilege. And so that's what I've been sort of stumping on recently, and happy to tell you more about what I've learned along the way.
Yeah, let's go there. Yeah, it's really interesting to just dive straight in, Alex. Yeah, and I think, on the surface, it seems like everything's looking rosy compared to, the distant past when you're looking at prohibition of psychedelic research, and it not being legal to marry or to have relationships if you're kind of not heterosexual. So on the surface, yeah, it looks like that. But why does it feel like we need to look at the past of how psychedelics were used for conversion therapy in particular? Why does that feel kind of relevant to bring into this renaissance on the surface as it appears to people?
It's 2023. There's a sort of received narrative that there's same-sex marriage, and Obergefell passed, and the Supreme Court said gay people can get married, and like everything's better now, and the Zillennials are like really into being gender fluid. And that to some extent is true. There has been massive cultural progress in the US and in many countries. And yet today, this has become not just a wedge issue, but an explosive moral panic, trans panic about trans people being outlawed from using bathrooms in a safe way. In more than 20 US states, legislation either having passed or passing that outlaws them from having basic, for both minors and adults, basic trans affirming healthcare practices. We see in New York City gay council members getting harassed in public, Proud Boys coming to drag events in libraries, armed and dangerous. We recently had a book launch for Queering Psychedelics. We have to put everyone through a metal detector at World of Wonder, which is RuPaul Drag Race's studio, because we're afraid that someone's going to bomb the place. And there have been, my dissertation research was on preventing suicide in gay and lesbian and bisexual kids. And the rates of suicide are highest in that population. It's not old men, it's queer trans youth. And as the average age of coming out used to be 28 and then 24 and then 20 and then 18, and now it's like 13 to 11, and you have many kids coming out when they're not even coming out anymore because there's no closet being built around them. So they end up in families, and in some families, in some cultures, in some schools, in some places of worship that are rejecting. And so there's actually been a huge spike in mental health problems, where it used to be that at least they were out of the house, maybe financially independent. Now they're coming out when they're young enough that they don't have any autonomy or independence, and they're actually in a hostile and rejecting family or school or gym locker room or church environment. And all of this is happening and it's become a politicized issue between the left and right in the United States. It's because, and all of this is related, I think, to psychedelics in some really important ways. Much of it is related around the lack of reckoning that we in the psychedelic community have had with our own past, and a reckoning with what's actually happening, not just in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but I mean like right now today. So conversion therapy is still happening today. Over 800,000 US adults are subjected to conversion therapy, which is a pseudotherapy that has been banned by a lot of professional organizations like the APA, where queer people are coerced to try to have attraction and have satisfying sexual relationships with their with people that they're not attracted to. And this causes all sorts of harms. It's been it's really stressful. A lot of people end up hurting themselves after these sorts of events. It engenders shame and self-hatred, and it also doesn't work. But psychedelics were seen as the leading way to convert people. Like they break down the ego and then you build it back up in a pro-social mode. This is what it was seen as shock therapy. My colleague Debus writes about this in France of shock therapy, like insulin therapy or other forms of rejection therapy, were massive doses of psychedelics. We're talking 800 mics of LSD were given to teenage boys who had been kissing and were deemed sexual perverts. The transcripts from these sessions is horrifying to hear. And it would be one thing if it were like an outlier, but like Tim Leary, Pied Piper of psychedelics, says, quote, LSD is a specific cure for homosexuality, end quote. Ram Dass, Dr. Richard Albert at Harvard, not just does conversion therapy with gay men, trying to make them have satisfying sex with their women partners, but publishes on it. Case studies. I mean, there's like you can check PubMed. It's in the literature right now and never retracted. I spoke with Ram Dass about his coming out, which he never formally did at the Psychedelic Science 2010 meeting in San Jose, and never really got a clear answer from him, unfortunately, about this sort of issue. And, Masters in Houston, the authors of the Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, said that mescaline in their treatment led towards heterosexualization. Hollywood Hospital, who treated Cary Grant and others, had a psychedelic conversion therapy program. There were programs in the UK treating lesbians to become straight women. And today, all of that's happened and no one's talking about it. And then today, in places like leading ayahuasca centers like Takiwasi, Jacques Mabit, highly respected ayahuasca center, like has a retrograde theory that psychedelic medicine helps people overcome their retrograde psychological position of being gay, like me. And and in organizations that I have respect for, including the UDV, which is highly homophobic practices, Santo Daime, where they do top-down gender sorting, men on the right, women on the left, men in pants, women in skirts, no place left for people who are non-binary. The perpetuation of the gender dyad, male, female, in our clinical trials, including in documents that are currently submitted to the FDA for large phase 3 trials, like typical, it's in the documentation, typical male female dyad. This kind of stuff is like replete in psychedelic clinical culture and in the clinic, including clinics that don't ask for people's pronouns or preferred names, or with clinicians who have never examined their cis hetero privilege or their white privilege or other forms of privilege that they may have. And I'm not okay with that. And I don't think that we should be either. And I don't think we have to be. So when we talk about MK Ultra and we talk about the abuses of boundary transgressions and sexual transgressions, we also need to be talking about how psychedelics have been used to harm people through conversion therapy and how they have repeatedly been used in this way. If we don't look to our past and what's happening currently, then I don't think we're ever going to have a truly integral reckoning with how we carry these medicines in ethical ways.
Thank you so much for putting that all down. And there's so much there that I wasn't aware of. I think I was familiar with some of that, but when you really go through the history and how it affects us now, there's just a heavy weight there that collectively we need to hold that. And I guess part of what I was initially asking was around that, I think, tendency to superficialize and to imagine that psychedelics will just heal everything, that will make us into an egalitarian society. All we need to do is just take that pill or eat that mushroom and wow, all the problems of the past are healed and here we are in utopia. It's actually no, like we're gonna have a lot of revelatory experiences, and some of that is gonna be based around harms caused in the past, and we need to be able to speak them out, and to have some kind of, I don't know what to call it, but whether it's a healing or what kind of an experience would it be individually, collectively, that this kind of groundswell and movement would engender.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what you think it would be like, right? I mean, moving past the utopian idea that psychedelics help wake everyone up or disinter our own internal discriminations, like what's it like if they're mind manifesting and amplifying, right, as Humphrey Osmond and Groff say. What is it like to drink ayahuasca with somebody who doesn't believe that your sexuality is natural? Like, what does it amplify? Like, what's the actual effect? If in the 1950s and 60s the culture was highly homophobic, and the leaders themselves had their own homophobias, or who hadn't come out yet, like Ram Dass, right? And how does that intensify or amplify the experience in psychedelic states of consciousness for people who are taking the medicine in a highly homophobic environment, or in psychedelic churches around the world, or in retreat centers that have sort of like don't really have a reflexive practice about this? And I think it's an open question. It's certainly not one that anyone's funding.
Yeah.
It's certainly not one that like the NIH and IMH have currently funded, or that there's like venture capital money for. There's certainly some academic interest in, but it's hard to. We don't actually have answers, but we do have a lot of. I get a lot of people writing to me talking about their not so good experiences as queer folks, broadly defined, in lots of psychedelic circles. I also get a lot of emails and calls from people who have had incredible experiences, who realized that they were bi or queer, or that they had internalized homophobia that was preventing them from even being in touch with their own, or transphobia with their own gender in a different way, with their own body. And so psychedelics have been agents for opening up our own internalized homophobia, our own internalized transphobia, of which we all have. Of course we have that. We grew up in homophobic and transphobic cultures. We carry that with us even today. So I think it's like, I think it's fascinating, and I'd be curious to see where it all goes.
Yeah, and I'm thinking it through, as we're talking, or there's the individual experience, and then there's a collective experience. And I think when we're talking about feeling safe as an individual, to go deep within and to share that with someone else, whether that's a clinician or a group ceremony, wow, just as that individual experience, can I be myself? Like, in a sense, I may not know what that even means. Can I start to explore within myself the parts of me that are there? Can I do that here? Am I safe with this person? And if you're, like you're saying, especially if I don't get asked on that intake form, what is my gender pronoun? And that there's nothing around me that shows like that I am welcome here, like no rainbow flag sticker on the door or anything like that. How can I heal there?
The most common thing that I hear from people is that they go through an entire course of psychedelic treatment with a provider, and they're queer, they're lesbian, gay, bi, trans, gender nonconforming, and it never comes up, and they never share it, and they literally go through preparation, medicine sessions, integration, and like they don't even talk about it. Which they didn't feel safe enough to talk about this big part of their life. Now, that might have something to do with the client, the person taking the patient, the participant, but I think it has something to do with what's happening in enactment between the practitioner and the person they're working with. And I learned from Flore St. Amy, who was a teacher for our EMBARK training program. She's a Black queer social worker who taught me that in psychedelic spaces and in spaces generally, there is no such thing as a safe space. There are just ways that we create different levels of safety together, and that you calling a place safe doesn't make it safe. Like, that's actually like a top-down. I think of it as an authoritarian sort of way of saying, like, this is a safe space. Well, your pronouncement does not make it so. It's actually up to the individual. Do they feel safe with this person in this moment, in this set and setting, to go there, to talk about that thing, their sexuality or that trauma or that difficult feeling, or to express those feelings, and I think that the depth of our clinical work with these medicines is driven by the depth of the clinician's own ability to be open to and receptive and aware of a lot of these important aspects.
And it is super relevant now with the laws and the regulations and the social pressures that are happening, not just in America, but particularly in some parts of America, where we're seeing a rolling back of the progress that have been made. So it really is important to have the conversations. And I'm thinking a lot of the vast majority of people that hold transphobic, homophobic, heteronormative views and opinions don't know anyone that is trans, or queer, and so they're kind of enforcing these top-down laws and proclamations without actually basing that on experience. And I think so there's not the visibility and the inclusion anywhere of queer folks, really, just looking at the business, science, political infrastructure, is that representative? And maybe, not just thinking about the percentage of representation, but just to feel the vibe, the ability to talk, to share, to express, to be authentic. Do we see that? Do we feel that? And all these realms of human, infrastructure? No, we don't. We really don't.
I think that a lot of the folks, so I sometimes do consultation for psychedelic retreats, and they want to do like an LGBTQ affinity circle. And one of the first things I say to them is like, you're already working with queer people. You may not know it, but like they're already coming through your doors for sure. Like it's already in every clinic. And even for people who have, like you said, I think they may not know that they have LGBTQ plus friends, colleagues, people in school, people like at their places of worship, but they do. And that's their, that's kind of the nature about being queer. It's also kind of the nature of being psychonauts, which is that like, these are not received identities. Andrew Solomon, who also teaches for our training program, the psychologist who writes about depression, but he also wrote a book called Far from the Tree, which is about like inherited identities. Like you inherit your race or your religious lineage, but like queerness, like it pops up everywhere. And so when queer people get together, they're not coming from a family tree where like their dad was also queer and their grandfather was queer. Like those sorts of identities are vertical. These are horizontal identities. And the same thing with people interested in psychedelic medicine. I think what I think of as psychonauts, which is that these are not vertical. Like just because your parents weren't interested in psychedelics may not have nothing to do with your own interest. They kind of come up across families. And so when we get a convergence, like a gathering of queer people together, you have people from many tributaries feeding into a single stream, many walks, many lineages, many esoteric traditions. So it's kind of a plurality. There's a lot going on. And similarly with psychedelic conferences. So there's this interesting social milieu that happens where you have people who aren't actually coming out of like a distinct lineage, but are actually a confluence of lineages threading together to weave a new mosaic, a new cultural tradition, which is syncretic in some important way. And I think that psychedelic medicine and psychedelic research culture has actually a lot to say for it in that way, and maybe a lot to learn from queer culture about what we know, what works, and also vice versa. I think that queer folks can learn a lot from from psychedelic cultures as well.
Let's take a dive into the book you've just released, Queering Psychedelics. And I have to be honest, I haven't looked at it, but I did manage to look at the sneak peek index. So I know what the chapters are called, and there's some really awesome articles there. Like I'm gonna get the book, and I really love the intersectionality of many of those articles, the chapters of the book. Yes, it's a book about queer psychedelics, but it's really looking at so many other intersections of identity and of history, that I think ultimately that infinite intersectionality is the beauty of psychedelics, bringing us together. So I love the idea of this existing on these horizontal planes of communities, and there kind of being this almost infinite web of intersectionality that we can find aspects of self in common. So you really, for me, seem to hit quite a lot of those in the book. So looks lovely.
Yeah, I don't think any one person holds the answers here. So the book is really an anthology of 42 different authors, many of them queer or allied, writing about a huge swath, micro chapters on a huge swath of topics. There's a great section, I think, on intersectional issues, and people like Terence Ching and Dr. Anderson Carpenter and Kevon Simpson and others write about issues of race and ethnicity and class mixed with being gender minority, sexual minority folks, and what that looks like, especially in the gay communities, which are often dominated by, I mean, I identify as queer and gay, but dominated by, like, oppressor group paradigms, white, cisgender, straight passing men. And I have many of those privileges, right? I pass as straight in many circles. I have the privilege of living as a white person. I have degrees and class background status that gives me a lot of privilege. And I can obscure my queerness in psychedelic research settings, like a lot, I can obscure it when working with people potentially. So I have passing privilege. But in queering psychedelics, it's one of the most diverse set of writers and authors and perspectives on a variety of topics, not just issues of like how to like queer the clinic and how queer folks can ally with other target groups, including BIPOC folks and Indigenous folks. Like how do we get together and allies and do this, because the divided and conquer strategy towards equity and diversity in psychedelic research is it's just not going to work. So that's exciting. And then lastly, and I got a little copy of the book here. It's this beautiful book you can order it from Synergetic Press, or you can order it from, a variety of bookstores online. It also is really expansive. It's about self-acceptance, which queer people, I think, have a lot to teach straight people about, because we've been forced to deal with internalized self-hatred and shame. There's a whole section on psychedelics and self-acceptance. There's sections on psychedelics and the body and pleasure. Like, why do psychedelics always have to be painful and hard work? Like, why is it always psychedelic work? And so people like Didi Goldpaw, they write about psychedelic pleasure and pleasure as like a therapeutic principle. And like, why can't we enjoy these experiences? We talk about new forms of psychedelic harm reduction, like how to deal with the epidemic of crystal meth addiction amongst men who have sex with men, or the opioid addiction that you've seen in recent documentaries, and that's killing more people every year because of fentanyl and carfentanil than people who died at the height of the plague years of HIV/AIDS in the 90s. And how do we use harm reduction principles to get people off of crystal meth and onto other either prescription drugs or CHU-C compound drugs like CHU-CB, CHU-CE? John Hoppert, who's a psychiatric nurse practitioner in the Bay Area, writes about, everything but the kitchen sink in his practice. And then we look towards like deep questions about like, what is queerness, and how are queer people, how have they been special in some ways as carriers of psychedelic medicine? And I believe that queer people have been boundary walkers across many cultures, across time, that oftentimes the person who carries the medicine is at the edge of the village, sometimes can pass into the marketplace, but is also like on the edge of the culture in some way, and between the realms of the sacred and the profane, of the realms of above and below, doing medicine and healing and shamanic work. And queer people, there's a law of convergence there and a lot of overlap, I believe, there, where we're overrepresented in healing professions and helping professions, where there's been a lot of overlap of queer people as medicine carriers traditionally, and sort of seeing queer folks historically and anthropologically in the past and in the future at places like festivals and expansive queer phenomenologies of the future, like what psychedelic culture in our future looks like, and does it have to be square and straight and fit into the old medical paradigm model, or can it be something a little different? And I think that queer folks have something to offer here, as well as to learn, and so I'm excited for that, and the book really charts a pretty broad rainbow bridge.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I love the term boundary walkers. That makes a lot of sense. And I was thinking about queer identity, queer experiences of reality, And yeah, it had that feeling of boundary walking, and so much of the psychedelic experiences, yeah, got around the idea of dualism and kind of the binary identities and choices that we typically have around good and bad and yes and no. And yeah, it's not grey that's in the middle of that. It is rainbow, like the just infinite shades and ombres, of colour, and it does bring in the importance of the body, sensuality and pleasure. It's not so much the brain, and yes, the brain's amazing, and a lot of psychedelic research focuses on that. But our body really is a beautiful mechanism for expressing truth. What feels right about who I truly am, about what do I actually need right now. And so it might be I don't need to lie in a room with bright lights and lab coats and eye shades and all of that stuff. Like maybe I just need to dance, or be out in nature, or just be with some friends and just not be quite so serious. And personally speaking, I can relate to that in my own psychedelic work. It's sometimes hard for me just to enjoy it and not go, okay, here I go, I'm going in, I'm gonna do some really deep stuff right now. I hope I come out the other side.
It's so serious. Why?
Yeah.
It can be so earnest too. I mean, there's a sort of like idea of the psychedelic moment of awareness, the peak moment, the peak experience, the mystical experience, where you're like, it's like the lone isolated node of consciousness meditator on the mountaintop, kind of seeing the big vision. And I don't think that's it. I don't think that conception of what it should be or could be actually honors the multiplicities, the vast expanses of actual phenomenal experiences. So my specialization has been in interviewing patients at NYU and at Yale and in coordination with Hopkins and in other studies, like patients are like, what actually happens for them? And one of the things about queer spirituality and this thing about the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which I've given it's sort of the short critique of it is that it's taken from theological literature for Advaita Vedanta and Christian mysticism. It was developed there and sort of dropped into psychedelics. And it has this idea of like mysticism as one, right? Like you have, and all other experiences, W.T. Stace writes, are lesser. If it has sight or sound, if the vision has sound and color or taste and smell, if it's embodied, that these are like lesser cases on the road towards a full awakening, but are kind of like secondary cases. And I think from a queer and feminist perspective that if we can encounter the real together in relationship with one another, it's not isolated. I think that we experience it in and of and with our bodies because we are embodied consciousness. It's not an escape from the body or the world. It's not escape beyond the world. It's an immanence in the world. And queer work is embodied, playful, irreverent, oftentimes of dogma and tradition, especially rigid, calcified dogma and tradition, and it's about caring for one another. And oftentimes it's also inherently political, right? Your spiritual experience is not outside the realm of justice, violence, the sort of like ethical underpinnings of what it means to be an alive human today in this world with everything that's happening. And queer spirituality is like driven by like it's political. It's about like we're like of the world and in the world. You can't go escape the world into your privileged little walled garden. And psychedelic consciousness doesn't, I think eventually if you get, for most people doesn't keep you there. You can work on your own issues, but for most people it brings up these bigger systemic issues of injustice, intolerance, and hurt in the world. And I think that queer psychedelic spirituality is, as long as it's seen as like a singular point that can be measured with a single questionnaire, is missing something really fundamental. And at least that's been my experience in talking with people and learning from them.
Yeah, and there's a number of new tools, assessment, screening tools that are coming out, and I just recently did the the what's connecting the scale and really enjoy and appreciate how different that feels. From your experience or knowledge, are there any other tools that you feel are somewhat more comprehensive, not necessarily accurate for, pathological diagnosis or symptom tracking, more just for that person that you are interviewing in that moment, for them feeling like understood, or for them to, when they're answering that question, to understand themselves through being asked that question. So that could be a screening tool, or it might just be more of a qualitative question that you ask your clients.
I mean, and some people listening, I'm sure, are trained in some form of therapy, psychotherapy, but I feel like to become a psychologist, I had to do 3,000 hours of training in psychotherapy, and I feel like I'm still learning how to ask a question. I did a 200-hour yoga teacher training. I thought I was going to do the complex handstand asanas. For me, like the 200 hours was like figuring out how to sit. How do I going to sit? I did another 200-hour Kundalini teacher training, and I just thought I was going to have mantras and all that jazz. And I was really just learning how to breathe and learning how to ask a question, to be there with a person, to be empathically related to them, to have done one's own work. I don't know how to encapsulate that. I will say that my research specialization has been qualitative research. So in the early days of psychedelics, I say early days, and we founded NYU in 2005, 2006. I was a founder there, working with the team at Hopkins, working with UCLA, working with Imperial. It was important in those early clinical trials to demonstrate efficacy. And so it was just let's get it through the IRB. Let's do the work in a highly integral way. Let's do it with the highest scientific rigor possible. And let's take existing gold standard measures and do pre-post measures and do that. But I raised my hand and others and said, it's important to not just from a top-down perspective, say we're going to just plunk in these assessments, like measures of altruism and pro-social behavior and nature relatedness and compassion and of course measures of depression and anxiety and trauma. Let's actually do qualitative interviews, semi-structured interviews, because these are not hypothesis testing, but hypothesis generating. When you sit down with somebody for 2 hours who's taken psilocybin, like we've been doing in our NYU cancer trial or the forthcoming religious leaders study, when you sit down with somebody for hours, you get this massive wealth of information. There's so much richness in the narratives and the stories and the phenomenal experience that the patients describe, and you can converge those experiences. And actually, it turns out that their psychedelic experiences don't exactly what we were measuring. We're kind of measuring over here. Some of it made sense. Some of it's not really that meaningful. But if you can devise measures by triangulating dozens of interviews and hundreds of pages of work and looking for common emergent themes, those map as items onto constructs, and then you can develop questionnaires that actually are about psychedelic work. They're not about some other practice that you just imported in, but are about psychedelic work. And so Roz Watts's work and many other people's work to develop measures that are actually more about psychedelic research and more germane to that actually get at something as ineffable as it may be, but actually get at something that's closer. I think it's really important. And I think it will be more important as the field matures from its kind of early adolescence.
Yeah, it's the ground up reverse engineering to develop these more qualitative interactions and relational kind of processes with clients on trials. And you've worked in loads of trials. I obviously want to hear a wee bit more about it. I want to hear about EMBARK particularly, but can I ask you a question about your experiences with MDMA on those clinical trials? I assume, was it part of the PTSD trials?
That's right. It was with the MAPS study in New York. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that for me is a really good example of a psychedelic compound that can be used, lying down with eye shades in psychedelic high dose or psycholytic potentially coming out of the session, or it can be, ecstasy. It can be used in raves. It can be have this kind of ecstatic, pure pleasure feeling to it. And when we're talking about queer culture in particular, the feeling I think that people can have on MDMA of kind of just really being in the moment and experiencing and expressing and feeling pleasure and often being in a social environment, like connecting with others, a sense of belonging, whether it's to the music, or to the peer group. There's something really special about it. So I'm interested, what were some of your learnings from working with MDMA in particular about that sense that a person was integrating aspects of their past and their future and aspects of their self that maybe have been more fragmented. So if there's a way of potentially focusing on those kinds of experience that patients were having around the MDMA, enabling to open up that space and kind of, explore inside.
I mean, Sasha Shulgin, the quote godfather of MDMA, like really did us a service by bringing this drug back from the lost archive. It was originally synthesized by Bayer Pharmaceuticals in the first decade of the 1900s. And then he brought it back and introduced it to therapists and psychologists, saying this is really helpful for goodness knows what. Let's see. MAPS, I think, made a very wise decision to pursue trauma and PTSD. And in that study, as in New York, we get to work with another therapist, and I got to work with people who've seen combat and been pinned down in Iraq, Afghanistan, and have their lives threatened and seen people killed and taken lives. Get to work with people who've been in near fatal car crashes, people who've seen their child nearly die in childbirth, people who've survived sexual abuse and rape. And you use the word fragmented. I think that's really helpful. Like, a lot of what we learned with severe PTSD is that a lot of people who, it's called quote criterion A, which means like you actually have to have it can't just be like the trauma of everyday life. You actually have to have like a life-threatening or sexual abuse experience in order to qualify to have PTSD. But most of those people had adverse childhood events, so things that had happened earlier in their lives that primed them to, when they had a trauma as an adult, to have this like ongoing set of symptoms like hypervigilance and never really feeling at ease and depression and anxiety. What I noticed in working with the one person who had seen combat trauma was that they, in the prep sessions you do psychedelic therapy, you ask about it. You're like, so what happened? Like, oh, and they were like, oh, I was pinned down, and then like afterward, the doc, debriefed me, and they gave me the day off. But in the medicine session with the MDMA, the people are kind of fragmented. It's like the trauma itself is kind of like in a separate little room. It's not. They tell the story, but they elide the actual thing that was hard. And so people are kind of trapped in a trauma narrative. It's like you're going downstream, the mixed metaphors, and you get trapped in a gyre. Like your raft, like you get thrown out of the raft and you just get around and around and around and around. And then you're trying to, with MDMA, people are able to enter that locked up little room and not just experience some of the feelings that they probably couldn't experience in that combat moment because they needed to keep themselves alive. And so there's catharsis, there's access to grief and fear and scariness. There's also, because you're with two people that you know and trust, there's some opportunity to do it with people, not alone. So there's some relationship there. And because your fear center's turned down, that gyre of trauma loop where you're just looping through the trauma, you never really resolve it, and you just deal with PTSD all day long, you pop out and you come out. There's some expression, there's some sharing, and then in the integration, you rewrite that narrative of like what happened to you, where it's no longer fragmented but integrated into a narrative where you can actually talk about it in a way and be conscious of it in a way where the mind isn't protecting the mind from its own most noxious life experiences, most painful life experiences. And it's really, as a therapist, I love doing talk therapy, but doing MDMA therapy is really meaningful, rewarding, and um, it's I can't, I'm really excited to see this disseminated in the culture, hopefully in good ways.
Yeah. The description you just gave, Alex, around PTSD, fragmentation of self and memories and the brain, it also makes me think of OCD, and I know that's something you're working on right now at Yale with psilocybin. And I was just had a conversation with a friend of mine about my OCD that I've had since I was a little kid.
Oh wow.
And just in brief, you know, in my teenage years and early 20s, I was battling it. I was trying to kill it, extinguish it, stop thinking like that, having these repetitive, thoughts and patterns and rituals. And then that was just horrific, like just murderous to experience that kind of battle within my brain at trying to stop something from happening. Just it was internalized, repetitive, rituals. And so then I had moved into a state of acceptance, and there's a part of my brain that I think I've just almost allowed to be a hostage to some extent, to be just do your OCD thing. That's cool. I'll be over here just doing my thing, and we can just live, cohabit beautifully together. But a bit of me feels like, there's still some more trauma lurking there that I really probably at some point when it's right can go into and understand why that kind of OCD ritual is still kind of looping around thousands of times a day. And so it just sounded a wee bit like how you were talking about PTSD as well, and how someone can evolve with that diagnosis.
I mean, I do think these are transdiagnostic, right? Like we can talk about that, but I mean, for you, you don't have to share this, but has psychedelics helped in any way with your OCD experience?
Yeah, so definitely when I was younger, that and cannabis really helped. A lot of it was, meditation tended to make it worse, just too intense. But being in nature and journaling was great. Yoga was great. And yeah, more in my latter stages. Yeah, definitely. Psychedelics have helped. Just digging into what is that trauma? What is that pain? What is that, in a sense, for me, self-hatred that kind of lurks there, that a part of me can't, isn't prepared to hold, or is scared of what might happen if I allowed it to kind of to come out. So yeah, just getting it a wee bit more personal. So there's definitely more to go in there. But OCD is just fascinating. I had a chat with Adam Strauss about it, kind of the psychedelic comedian who's had really struggles with OCD, and he jokes about it. And for me, that's how I've learned to do it. Like yep, there's this part of my brain, it just does its thing, and I just let it do its thing. It's on a leash, and we're good friends. Just to joke about it a wee bit, rather than think, God, there's something really wrong with me. I am fucked up. I'm gonna go mad. So I've kind of eased off that.
I haven't talked to Adam about it. That might sounds like a lot of fun, but look, OCD is notoriously difficult to treat with therapy and or with conventional psych meds. Um, it has lots of different manifestations. This is a great study, neurocorrelates study. I'm a co-investigator, but it's really being led by Dr. Ben Clemendi and the team up in New Haven at Yale. And it's kind of great because the NIMH, the National Institutes of Health, Mental Health, hasn't funded psychedelic research in 50 years, but they broke that by funding this study. And then I think there's a little bit of a debate about it, but then Hopkins also nearly simultaneously or a little after got funding for Matt Johnson's incredible research with smoking cessation. But the Yale program, looking at OCD, when I do long form interviews with people who have OCD, who've taken psilocybin in our study, the individual trajectories are really compelling, because there's it's a lot of people use this metaphor. It's like the volume was just turned down, and none of them said like I'm cured, like I no longer have obsessional thought patterns or compulsive behaviors, but a lot of people said I, I can be in relationship with my girlfriend again in a way that I really didn't have space for, because these were like people who had really severe, insistent, intrusive OCD symptoms. And it's fascinating to me. In this, it's early stages. It builds on some of earlier research by Francisco Moreno, who had very promising reductions in OCD symptomatology on the Y box, which is the gold standard measure here for OCD severity. And we've published a poster recently on this, and we're doing qualitative interviews with all the folks. So some of the stories will come out. So I'm really excited about it. I've learned a lot about OCD, which was not really in my original wheelhouse. Um, I'll just end by saying you said something about like it's like murderous. I think a lot of people, whether it's OCD or depression or queerness, they take psychedelics and up until then they've been trying to like kill a part of themselves. Like this thing that I'm ashamed of, that's like that has needs, that wants to be this thing that isn't this thing, that wants to be straight that isn't this thing that's happening for me all the time that I hate doing, this addictive part, this obsessional part, this whatever part. There's like an internal, almost like pre-verbal desire to kill it off. There's this idea that I'll get better if I can just cut this away, like surgically remove this part of my psyche. And they see it as ego dystonic. It's like not part of me. I mean, Jung talks about integrating the shadow, but there is this like it's like a murderous campaign, and I've seen this come up time and time again. Where with psychedelics, I think sometimes bad trips are people like coming up against that and not being able to, in the moment, not being adequately resourced or supported to have the ability to like deeply accept, embrace, and even love that monstrous part. I think it's possible. I don't think that we can excise parts of ourselves out. I don't even, I mean, we need to prevent harms to others and ourselves, but these are the parts, like I think that psychedelics can help us do that. Sometimes it might catalyze it too quickly for some people, but I think that might be transdiagnostically one of the mechanisms that helps us. Why, if we ask ourselves the questions like, how do psychedelics work? Why do people get better across different diagnoses? Like, I think it has something to do with this.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting just connecting what we started off talking about with the conversion therapy piece, which in a sense is trying to, exile a part of us.
A
And to
socially
paper over it.
sanctioned program to exile, to kill off a part of ourselves. Yeah.
So really, yeah,
or to bury it alive. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot to talk about. Too much. I want to spend some time diving into EMBARK, but you did just mention something that caught my ears around, I think you said a religious leaders study, and I haven't heard much about that. Would you be right just kind of chatting around that a wee bit?
Yeah. So a few years ago, people like Bob Jesse and Roland Griffiths and Cody Swift and Tony Bossis, myself and others helped create a study for religious leaders. So this was a joint effort between New York University and Johns Hopkins, and it comes out of this sort of like idea that psychedelics occasion mystical, religious, spiritual, profound experiences. And there's the Marsh Chapel experiment, right, at Marsh Chapel, where psilocybin was given to 10 divinity students in 1962, I believe. What if we rekindled that spiritual research with psychedelics, not just with long like lifelong meditators, but let's bring in priests and clerics and rabbis and imams and Orthodox Greek priests and Zen teachers from many different walks, and give them high doses of moderate to high doses of psilocybin in a supportive preparatory and integration framework with two therapists. And then let's ask them about their experience of spirituality, of the God of their understanding. Let's ask them how it affects how they speak with their congregants, how they give sermons on Sundays, how they do their work in the world. So everyone in this study is a religious leader or a professional. They make their full-time living doing this. Um, my role was doing these long form interviews with these folks, which are very bright, very, speak intelligently and are able to talk about this weird thing that McKenna talks about, the weirdness of the psychedelic experience, but to couch it within different epistemological world frames, like different lineages of worldview. And it's humbling, fascinating to work with them. Like, they're humans like everybody else. They're burnt out like everybody else. They're witnessing this sort of like crisis of faith in their congregations across the board in the 21st century, and seeing how the old ways are often not helpful, and speak beautifully to their experience. And I spoke with an Orthodox priest who said, before I used to give sermons to my congregation, and I would talk about God's justice, the justice of the Lord. And now, after taking psychedelics, he had a really powerful experience. He says, all I want to talk about is God's love. And this is like a big fella. Like, he didn't sound like the kind of guy who'd be like love and peace and yada yada. He tears up and says, I just want to speak to them about God's love. And so, I think this like esoteric traditions across different faith traditions and psychedelic religious mystical experiences, which has a long lineage, is like a fascinating set of studies. And it broadens psychedelics beyond this like somewhat limiting medical model into the full human project of like being alive and being spiritual existential beings trying to find meaning in a world that doesn't always make sense.
Oh, I'm just taking a breath into that, Alex. Yeah, fascinating. It really is fascinating how psychedelics can have, that kind of impact on clergy, on spiritual leaders, if we want to use that word, and affect how they interact with their congregation. And the fact that you're mentioning love there, LOVE, beautiful word that we definitely do not use enough of, or prioritize or value highly enough. So much as happiness, and as well, I think love is just, it just seems almost, I think culturally speaking, seems to be castigated as somewhat naive and childish and needy. Whereas it's a pure, infinite quality and experience that we all deeply, deeply need. To receive, to feel within, and to give and to share, to be part of, and to know that it just exists. And it's so important to reconnect with love. And I feel like psychedelics have that ability to kind of break it out of this kind of rigid shell of kind of rational mindedness, as does queerness. Like, love is such a huge part of what guides authenticity and who I am and who I need to be. That's kind of the North Star, I feel.
Yeah, and we talk about it at arm's length through socially sanctioned words like compassion or attunement or congruence. There's all these sort of like terminologies in psychotherapy, but of all people, it was Freud who said, like, what else is it but a cure through love? And I think that it's okay to use that four-letter word. It's also okay to keep it special sometimes too.
Speaking of love, I love EMBARK. Nice subject change there. I want to talk about it because I really like what you've done there, and it is part of the great need to talk about what works. Why does it work? How do we almost operationalize this or standardize this or start to make this a training for clinicians and practitioners that want to do this work effectively, ethically, help to scale this out so we just know what works. And I had a chat with Sarah Bate up in England a couple of weeks ago about what she's working on at Clerkenwell Health, and they've got something similar they're working on, with CBT and acceptance commitment therapy and mindfulness, and these really core skills and values and models of working with people that use psychedelics beyond just talking about harm reduction and integration, that really get more into the how how do I do this, and how do I inculcate these skills within me? How do I learn to do this? And so I love what Embark is. So with that being said, can you tell people what is this thing called Embark, and where did it come from with yourself and your kind of co-creator, co-author?
Yeah, I want to express some gratitude to Dr. Bill Brennan, who's my co-creator and colleague and collaborator here. My question to you and to like the audience who's listening is like what? So like, okay, psychedelics work sometimes or a lot of the time. Like, how do they work? Why do they work? And what are the best ways of working with them? So psychedelic therapy, PAT, psychedelic support has become, it's a combination therapy, unlike most other psychopharm drugs, right? And it comes from indigenous lineages, it comes from Western psychotherapeutic lineages. But when we did a canvas of the 17 different models of psychedelic therapy that have been published, we saw like a pretty broad array of things. And there were some fascinating, and we talked with senior teachers, and we drew actually from my interviews with patients and others to say, well, if you had to design a therapy from the ground up that wasn't like, let's take CBT for smoking cessation and combine it with set and setting protocol. I mean, that works. That works at Hopkins, but it's not a therapy that was designed for the psychedelic work. And so these 17 therapies that we see in the literature, and it's published in Frontiers in Psychology, if you're interested in like the 17 different psychedelic therapies that have been put out there into the world and have been tested. Some of them, about half of them, like use existing EBTs, evidence-based therapies. It's like, let's do acceptance and commitment therapy with psychedelics. Let's do CBT. Let's do, motivational interviewing with psychedelics. And the other half are sort of like coming out of this set and setting model, sometimes coming out of like an underground secret chief kind of model. A lot of the problem was that a lot of these weren't manualized or like fully coherently theoretically baked. It wasn't like clear like why they worked, why these techniques were selected. It's just like, we just do this thing, but there wasn't like a coherent form. So we came up with EMBARK. EMBARK is an acronym. It's a 6-letter acronym for the 6 clinical domains that we have consistently see a rise on psilocybin and other psychedelic journeys for people. The E stands for the existential and spiritual domain. People have existential experiences, confrontations with death, and religious experiences, spiritual, mystical experiences. The M in EMBARK stands for mindfulness. It's about being in the present moment, learning to love oneself, without judgment, to just be. The B in EMBARK, and a lot of these 17 treatments were missing this, was the body aware domain. A lot of them had nothing about the somatic techniques that therapists could use, somatic grounding. When I interview psilocybin patients, they're like shaking and things are happening in their body. There's convulsive events in their body. They're having visions of things being ejected from their torso. There's very physical, somatic. So there's an entire domain about the body as a site of healing and of trauma. The A in EMBARK is for the affective and cognitive domain, which is all of the. One patient said, I felt all the feelings I've ever felt in my entire life. Like, how do you deal with this like huge amount of feeling? How do you approach feelings rather than avoid them, which is what we normally do to keep ourselves safe? And how do you think about the feelings that you have so that if you feel angry, you don't immediately shut that down and feel guilty for feeling angry as a secondary feeling? The R, the 5th domain in EMBARK, is the relational domain. This just acknowledges that, like, actually set and setting, a huge part of it is like not whether or not there are candles, but whether or not you're having a safer relationship with your therapy dyad, if you have good rapport with them, your relationship with the people that you're working with. And when I speak with participants, they consistently in their psychedelic visions saw their mom, their dad, that boyfriend that they broke up with but never got an apology from 20 years ago, their grown daughters, the lineages of their mothers and fathers' lines. Their relationships were deeply embedded, and I think that those relationships is part of the healing process for many people across different indications. The last domain is the K domain, and this is about, like, you can't just have altered states of consciousness. You actually have to work to translate those into altered traits, to take advantage of this neuroplastic critical learning window which opens, that we can learn new behaviors like exercising or walking down the lane, and give up old behaviors like maybe having too many drinks or depressive ruminative thought patterns. And so K is for keeping momentum. It's a relapse prevention piece to help people operationalize some of what's happened in the medicine sessions in the days, weeks, and months beyond, for durability of benefit over 6 months, 1 year, and beyond. The last thing I'll say about EMBARK is that a lot of the previous methods were missing ethics. They were like, yeah, if you're a psychologist, you should abide by your ethical code, but there's like no ethics in the work, in the therapy work itself, built in. And so EMBARK has 4 care cornerstones. The 4 care cornerstones are the work is we try to provide and strive to provide trauma-informed care, ethically rigorous care, culturally competent care, and fourthly, this thing we call collective care, which is about how we have a systemic lens towards injustice in our society and don't try to make it about the individual's personal pathology, but seeing them within structures of power in their life, in their workplace, in their family systems. And so these 4 care cornerstones sort of bookend and are interlaced throughout the work for EMBARK.
Beautiful. That must have taken quite a while to do all of that. Yeah, the research and then the formulation. What's the plan for where EMBARK can be used? So I know there's a book coming out. And does EMBARK, is that part of Cybin? Or is it kind of, who's going to train people in the EMBARK method, I'm wondering?
Yeah, we've open sourced it entirely. And so you can go to embarkapproach.com and actually sign up for 15 hours of teaching on EMBARK as part of a sort of a pre-certification record of completion sort of fundamentals. So feel free to do that for free. We've made that available to the community for free. We developed EMBARK for Cybin's clinical trials with medicines like psilocybin and DMT, and also for a study at the University of Washington to treat, that Dr. Tony Back and others are leading, to treat and work with symptoms of depression amongst frontline healthcare workers who are suffering from moral injury and compassion fatigue and burnout after the pandemic. The book is going to be published by Oxford University Press. It's due out later this year. Really excited to see it carried there. And the last thing I'll say is, I know like EMBARK is 6 domains and 4 care cornerstones, but actually the whole idea is that like for different people, psychedelic work is different. You're not going to have all 6 of these domains, and maybe these 4 care cornerstones aren't going to be important. But for one person, what we found is that oftentimes like they have the psychedelic journey with psilocybin, and then the body becomes an emergent domain for them, like that. And so then you focus on that in integration, and maybe like mindfulness is like less important, or maybe it's like not about the spiritual experience for them. So it's an open architecture. It's multidimensional, but it allows for the therapist to bring in their existing skill sets, and it allows for a patient-centered approach to like what might actually emerge or arise. Because I don't think there's one path for psychedelic healing. What we see are multiple trajectories, and we needed to build a comprehensive theoretical framework for psychotherapy that allows for different expressions of that for different people.
Yeah, I agree. There's not one path. There probably is a fundamental kind of foundation of skills and definitely ethical values in particular that I think we can build on. I love that you used the word architecture there, like we are building upon it. Taking it in different directions depending on our own proclivity, but as long as we kind of base it on those foundations we're building on, then it's an organic growth from that kind of fertile ground. That sounds really cool. And I love that there's 15 hours free available. So what's the website for that, just so people can check that out?
Yeah, visit embarkapproach.com. And you can sign up there for free, register there for free for the 15 hours. Like I said, we wanted to open source this. And EMBARK is a meta model, meaning it can be adapted for different psychedelic medications, and it can be adapted for different indications. So we're initially working with depression and symptoms of depression, but it can be adapted and other teams can take it up. Like we're in part hoping that people will take it up to adapt it for generalized anxiety, as Simon is doing, to adapt it for addiction, to adapt it for other challenges that people may have. So it's sort of like a meta model that you can create a manual for a particular drug and a particular thing for a particular study or for your own practice in clinic or elsewhere.
That's awesome. That's huge. Thank you. One final question I've got. You just mentioned the study, I think you said out of Washington, that you're doing with first responders.
Yeah.
And again, sorry, I'm an Englishman. Are we talking Washington State or Washington, D.C.?
It's Washington State. And I'm not doing it. I was connected to doing the training to develop EMBARK, but Dr. Tony Beck and his team are leading that at the University of Washington in the Seattle area.
Yeah. So there's definitely a cultural competence piece to this as well, working with first responders, frontline medical personnel, that like there's a certain kind of person and it's a certain kind of role and reality of doing that kind of work. So it's interesting how, we're talking about kind of queerness and we can also talk about, frontline healthcare workers and what they're going through and how to kind of really help them. So what are some of the ways that this work would look different or is being designed, particularly for frontline healthcare workers, particularly after their experiences with the COVID pandemic?
Yeah. Well, the good news is that it's being led by people like Tony and his team who are already healthcare professionals and have at least some, like they're actually treating their colleagues in many ways. They know something about it. And when you're treating doctors and nurses, my understanding is that all of the social locations that you're in, whether you're man, woman, cis, trans, white, African American, Latinx, a working professional doctor or not, like all of these things need to be thoughtfully adapted. I mean, one of the interesting anecdotes that I heard was that there's a certain disposition for people who become physicians, who go to medical school. They're like, they've worked really hard to get where they are, oftentimes maybe worked too hard. And the experience with psychedelics is the encounter with psychedelic consciousness. This like trusting and surrendering and letting go is not what they teach people in medical school. So, it's like about being an authority and having sort of a mastery and competency and control. So there's like an interesting set of challenges potentially to working with different folks. I had to learn it, when working with combat vets. Like I had never enrolled in the armed forces. Like I'm not familiar with the jargon. I'm not like, I don't know what they're saying. I don't have those shared life experiences. So, it's incumbent upon clinicians to really learn as much about the people you're working with as possible, in order to forge a real connection with them and to be culturally humble about that.
Awesome. All right, that was the last question. I'm going to resist the urge to ask more, but I do want to ask one final question. Just what else do you want to talk about that I haven't asked you? Is there anything else we didn't get to cover?
Oh, can we talk about? Wow. I mean, I'd love to talk about the future of the psychedelic future and where this is all going. Like, I'd love to talk about how what we learn from psychedelics helps us to change the structures of how we live together. I mean, literally in terms of like housing and addressing the epidemic of loneliness and like deep structural issues and sort of late liquid capitalist notions of like how we should work and live in like tiny little boxes, but not necessarily in related scenes, like how it changes our relationship with religion and like the religions of the 19th and 20th centuries, how they changing and are changed by people who take psychedelics and then reconceive of new ways of being in connected, more sacred consciousness with one another. I'm interested in group therapy for psychedelics, especially like in clinical models, because I think it's really hard to do. And I'm interested in couples and conjoint therapy with MDMA and other work, as I know and I've seen how powerful that can be. So there's a lot of things we could talk about maybe next time. But I really have loved chatting with you. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, I can go a little bit longer. Do you want to try and touch on some of those subjects? Because I love all of those.
Sure. Go for it.
Let's see if we can, yeah, keep it going. I'm fascinated by just how do psychedelics affect how we want to live, like, our lifestyle, our work balance, our housing situation. Um, yeah, I've lived in eco villages and communes and kibbutzim in Israel. Yeah, and there's a different quality of life there. Nature is more prominent and connection is more prominent. Now, yeah, I live in New Jersey and I spend all my time looking at my laptop, and this is my reality now. So how does psychedelics kind of shake that up? I wonder. What are some of the needs, I guess, that it brings us to? I guess we're saying connection. I believe for me, nature, and I think, a part of our problem is just we've become so ignorant to living in nature and being part of nature and belonging to nature and honoring, nature and the universe as well. So some of that kind of then moves into this spirituality. Like, what does it mean to have life to have more meaning, and in a sense to have more belonging and responsibility to life and humanity and our collective future? So yeah, where do you want to go with it? These are all really, really important integrations, and I think ways of applying psychedelic experiences to heal beyond the individual.
Uh, I'll try to. I'll address your questions inside out, which is to say, with Casey Palios and Jeff Guss, we talked about this idea of like what do psychedelics do, and I see them as egolytic agents. They promote egolysis. The ego is an idea, right? It's not like a literal thing, but the ego serves three functions traditionally, and and you talked about connection. It helps us to it helps to loosen the ego, becomes less rigid. William James talks about this. It helps to the confining selfhood begins to melt down, is what William James says. But with under psychedelics, the ego functions start to loosen and become more loose, become egolytic rather than ego rigid. And it's connected to how we live, and it's connected to spirituality. It's connected to how we connect with one another, because the ego has three functions. It separates us. It protects us from what's unconscious. So protects us from, we are conscious of this. It creates a boundary from the unconscious, because it's subconscious material is threatening. It's like really scary stuff. It also the ego under everyday waking consciousness keeps me disconnected from you. Like, you're there, and the room is there, and the tree is there, and I'm here. Like, there's a discrete boundary, like it's less permeable, and that's actually good for everyday waking, efficiencies and from a organistic perspective. And then lastly, this ego death thing is that the ego functions. The third function of the ego is to keep, is to it keeps the boundary between self and no self. Like, I'm existing versus I'm fractally dissolving into nothing, and I'm dying. This death rehearsal idea. And with psychedelics, like, how can you go through those experiences and not return to our world where the housing was built in sort of like a Henry Ford style, like bunker, or our tenement housing apartment in New York City and cookie cutter suburbia was designed to keep people separate, where religious theologies were designed in some measure for generations past that don't speak to us today. How can we have survived 3 years of a pandemic that upended every way in which we interact with each other, and not come out of it with this incredible tool, psychedelics, to not do a superficial redo, but like deeply reorganize how we work, how we live, how we pray, what the design and meaning of our lives is? I think it's really challenging, all of these things in profound ways. And look, I'm not like a pie in the sky sort of like collectivist, but I've tried to live in community with people. But I think that we are facing an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. Famously, the US Surgeon General said that loneliness has the same health negative effect as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day on our cardiovascular health and our mental health and our substance use issues or alcohol issues. And I think, I don't think psychedelics are a panacea or cure all, but I think that they help us experiment with like different ways of being together. And it doesn't have to be one way. That's what I've learned. It really does not have to be one way, and it does not have to be the old way. Um, I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Some of the themes we've been covering so far around there not being just one way, you know, and that psychedelics bring up this just question of like, what's right? What do I need? How can this feel better? It's like the sense that the focus is on the questions and on there being like a fluid process and a kind of co-creating and ever-evolving reality. Whereas I think typically tend to have this kind of binary, dualistic, like, you know, this things are set. The reality is the way that it is. You know, I have very little choice or freedom or kind of liberty to control my own life, or to change the way that my social dynamics are, or the kind of lifestyle that I have, and in a sense to try and belong to a community where we are co-creating, or at least having those discussions around like, how do we want to spend our time, like what brings meaning, and especially like being a parent as well, like really thinking about my kids, and I don't want them to have the kind of childhood that I had. You know, there's some good things there for sure, but boy, just trying to give more nurturing to really taking that time to think about how we can be unique, how we can help others to be unique, how we can see all the complexities of self and the complexity of other. And, you know, I live in this town that is so fragmented by race and religion. You know, I'm in the Jewish bubble, and then over the train tracks, you know, there's an African American community, and we have very little time together. Sometimes my kids do kind of sports at the local sport complex, and, you know, that's where the communities mix together. But other than that, like, there's a Jamaican grocery store I go to, I love, and I get flowers there, you know, every now and again. And that's where I have a little bit of just experiencing the non-Jewish world. And I think I can extrapolate that to beyond just an N of one of myself. Like, we tend to just aggregate in these little bubbles of just the psychedelic community, you know, and it's good to get out of that and just not just talk about that and be with other people that have similar experiences that love psychedelics as much, just to be just in, you know, how do we just connect with others. And I think psychedelics definitely can be a catalyst to having that curiosity, to wanting to know people for who they really are, and to working on any beliefs that we have that stop us from having that curiosity and that love and acceptance for all of our kind of multitudinous beauty.
What you're saying makes me think, you know, this idea of having a reflexive practice as a therapist and unpacking our knapsack of privilege, of like when the water goes out, like what are all the structures in your mind and psyche that like were adaptive at some point potentially, or that you learned, like internalized racism, internalized sexism, internalized homophobia. And then when the water goes out, you see all the structures in your, and I mean, when you take psychedelics, sometimes you sort of amplify that. You can see it maybe more clearly. And then the water comes back in. And so I think that, you know, look, our great, 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 great grandparents grew up in a time where your last name was, you know, like Potter or something, because like they created pottery, and like that's what you were going to do. You had no agency, as you put it. And with the rapidly accelerating, everything coming loose at the seams moment where we have so much agency to some extent in some of us, and it feels like systemically like there's like lots of autonomy in some ways and actually huge confinement in others, and things are changing so rapidly. Psychedelics offer some, I mean, if we can have a thoroughgoing reflexive look at what's happening inside of ourselves, and they also allow us to like adapt to a world that's changing faster than our great 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 grandparents could ever have imagined, like I don't know how else you do it. I think everyone I know has whiplash. Like, we just can't keep up with the meaning of the world as it is today. And you either get smaller and like turn inward, or you somehow increase one's musculature, your capacity, your like open, your ability, your carrying capacity to be with what is. And my hope would be that their best psychedelic practice could be that, and has been that, I think, for some people.
I like that the choice that we have. We can choose to be smaller And in a sense, that can often feel like a safer choice, or the more kind of risky, scary choice, like to stretch and grow and evolve into parts of uncertainty, into the unknown, and but to be bigger. Beautiful. All right, so Alex, we just did an encore. When you go to the theatre, you know, they do an encore, or when you hear a band play. So that was beautiful. I'm really happy we did that for everybody and for ourselves.
I'm happy to do it.
All right. So I think now is a beautiful time. For me to say thank you. You've been around a while in the psychedelic world doing this work for some time. You started young, similar to Matthew Johnson. You kind of started young and just stay with it. You found something that you love, and it's beautiful that to see how you're evolving with that, and really important work. So thank you very much for what you've done, what you're doing, and just that openness to continue evolving the work. For folks that want to connect with you, find out more about some of the projects you're part of, could you just direct them to how they would find that information about you and your work?
Yeah, absolutely. My socials are on Alex Belser on Linktree. My website's alexbelser.com, and my practice is centerforbreakthroughs.com. And if you're interested in EMBARK, embarkapproach.com has the free material there, and the book should be coming out later. It's really lovely to be on the program again. Hope to do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, let's do it sooner than 4 years. I know that the book Queering Psychedelics. How do people buy that? I don't know if it's probably on Amazon, but can they not buy it on Amazon, please? Is there anywhere else?
Yeah, they can order it from other online booksellers like Barnes and Noble, and or ask their local independent bookseller to buy it. You can also leave reviews on Amazon, which I know is a little controversial, but that is how people seem to find out about things. But the book is called Queering Psychedelics: From Oppression to Liberation in Psychedelic Medicine, and please do check it out. It's a nice sprinkling of little micro chapters. Feel free to jump around at any topic that pleases your fancy.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, really enjoyed the conversation.
All right.
Take care. Yeah, thanks for listening, folks. All the best.